When I had the idea to go and photograph the ANC in exile, I knew South Africans who knew people in the ANC, and I was examined closely by London ANC people as to whether I would be a suitable material to be shipped out to photograph their secrets. At the time, the biggest moral issue for the capitalist world was, what are we going to do about South Africa? Because everyone knew that it was a criminal situation. The ANC began to creep towards the idea that it would be possible for me to go and visit ANC headquarters in exile, which eventually I did. It was hugely optimistic on my part, their part, and it was an optimistic moment. And I stayed several weeks. But because Mandela was then released, the week after I got back, all those pictures become completely and totally irrelevant. Those pictures have sat on a shelf in boxes for the best part of 30 years, ever since, really, waiting for this exhibition. And I certainly didn't think I was shooting a story called Promises and Lies when I went out originally. I stayed many weeks, and slowly but surely they showed me and gave me access to things they were doing in exile. Because essentially they wanted me to create propaganda for them, which is always part of the problem, that you are both reporting on something, but you're also a sympathetic voice. I went to Lusaka. It was an occasion when Mr. Sisulu and all those other people who'd been released at the same time all arrived. Kenneth Kaunda was obviously there. Mugabe was there. Sisulu flew up to Dodoma in Tanzania to visit one of the big camps. So it was a fantastic occasion. I've been in Ireland, I've been in war zones. It was fairly relaxed, although intellectually they were very suspicious of what might be going on and who might be listening and so on. I waited and waited and waited on the promise of seeing, so-called an army, an equipped and well-drilled army, which was clearly not the case. I photographed what I was shown. Clearly there were people who were involved in going into South Africa and carrying out certain military-type operations, but they weren't going to be wearing, like the IRA, they don't wear uniform when they go and do that. So it's much more about surveillance than it was a direct threat. It was very obvious to me, having spent time with them in Lusaka, that in fact, in many ways, the East German Communist Party, as one of their major supporters, had a lot to answer for in terms of their sense of what administration or democracy might prove to be. The East German model is top-down, we tell you what's going to happen and why it's a good thing. It seemed to me that their main desire was to control the political situation more than to open it up. The ANC told me they had a prison and they had incarcerated several people who were collaborators. They were specifically not telling me what they'd been accused of. When I said, well, okay, they're in prison, but what about any kind of court hearing? No. It's like the IRA. We deal with it ourselves, and that's that, under special circumstances. To which you can only say, yeah, I can see why you might do that.
Comrades, we must not romanticize Umkhonto weSizwe. The idea behind this college was to prepare the South African youth to play a role not only in our struggle, but a role in future.
Everybody turned up and came and went. I met a lot of people, took their pictures. Chris Hani, very forceful, very clear-sighted, and very determined, and probably in many ways represented a much more coherent and practical politics of the ANC than a lot of the people that I met who were much more, how shall I say, more Machiavellian, more politically manoeuvring and so on. Mr. Mbeki, my impression was he was very gentle, very quiet, thoughtful, and clearly the next big thing. Paulo Jordan was moderately helpful, not entirely helpful, and we know what happened to him. Mr. Slovo taught me how to do a proper barbecue. Mr. Zuma, he was very helpful, charming, witty, and in many ways much more urbane than a lot of the, shall I say, older communists, for whom I have great respect, but they were much more cautious and much more circumspect about what they said. Someone like Zuma would always be chatting and come and say, oh, he's important or she's not, and they're of this wing, that tendency. He was much more interested in what people were up to I remember saying to Zuma, in many ways, the East German model of social organisation and politics has quite a big influence on the ANC. And he laughed. He said, yes, I mean, in many ways, that's true. A lot of people who will be significant in the ANC have been trained in essentially, a single party state. And we will have to address that.
The Jacob Zuma government is essentially a coalition government within the ANC, from the Youth League to other groups, etc., who all form part of an alliance. And what united that alliance was the removal of the Thabo Mbeki regime, which meant that there was never really a common vision as into what kind of economy, what kind of society, what kind of continent, or what kind of world that this group sought to achieve, which meant that they were preoccupied more with being in power and what being in power meant than doing the very basic things that the electorate demands of you. When that term comes to an end, right, when people realize that all these alliances have become obsolete, things begin to fall apart.
Zuma is a man who everyone tells me from the old days was an extraordinarily brave liberation fighter. And what we're seeing now is a man who is fighting for his political life, and that the closer he gets to his political demise, the bolder he gets. And that's bravery then becomes a very destructive asset rather than a positive asset. So that's why we're in a very delicate phase. As the end of his rule approaches, so he is apparently willing to do almost anything in order to survive and preserve power.
What about our rights to film here? The media is entitled to film.
The original sin at the moment is corruption. Whereas 30 years ago, when we were part of the struggle at its height in the 80s, the apartheid system was the original sin. We now have to mobilize ourselves and gear ourselves towards institutionalizing the fight against corruption.
Sorry, move back. Sorry, move back.
Please, move, man, please. Just move.
Just move, guys.
Make way.
Did you get the money, guys?
South Africans came here to hear the issue. You can't scramble a signal to stop them from hearing it. Robs the people of South Africa of what President Nelson Mandela fought for, which is the upholding of the rule of law and the Constitution.
It's about restoring the dignity and the integrity of our Constitution and Parliament. It has got nothing to do with my party. It has got everything else to do with accountability in South Africa.
I see your shirt's ripped. I saw some of your colleagues swinging punches. Do you think charges will be pressed against you?
No, I don't know. We are pressing charges against the police. Viva President Zuma! Viva! Viva! Viva President Zuma! Viva! Viva! Party ANC! Party!
As a 19-year-old entering the ANC and been fortunate enough to be in special ops, you worked around the clock, and it was physical work and just dangerous work. We were given very little money to survive in the country with, but we had to account for every cent spent. And we would mumble and grumble amongst ourselves that here we are, an illegal, underground revolutionary organization, but we had to account for every cent spent, and we had to provide receipts. We were trained how to plan for operations and to deal with any eventuality in case things go awry. There was never a sense from us that we were cannon fodder or we were getting just thrown in. So the move towards excellence, accountability, care and concern for one another was instilled from my very first moment in there.
If peaceful negotiation will result in the formation of a united, democratic, non-racial and non-sexist South Africa. We are not only willing, but ready to enter into such negotiation.
The election of Comrade Nelson Mandela to the post of president.
It was not possible to despair because the spirit of the people outside was too great.
They have given us that great opportunity to take this country and put it in our hands. And they have said to us, take South Africa forward, improve it, transform it, make sure that the Freedom Charter is realized, make sure that our people lead a better life.
At the time of the unbanning, we had more diplomatic missions in the world than the apartheid government. We were well known, and we were known for our ability to think through things, to reason, and to look for solutions. So clearly people who had experience of governance, policy formulation, were in the ascendancy. But there was a certain amount of resentment building up, especially with people from the armed wing or people who were internals, because we sort of became irrelevant in a way. The government of national unity broke down, the National Party collapsed, and ANC absorbed a lot of National Party people. And a lot of those came in with, they understood business, they understood corruption, they understood the unreasonable temptation of money. And many of them got involved in business and involved ANC people in business.
We always tend to think that we are so special. I don't think we're that special. It happens everywhere, where the politics going from sort of almost a hyper-politics in which the bad guys were really, really, really bad and the good guys were fantastic and really, really good, to a normal political situation in which it gets messy, it gets confused, it gets morally tainted. And so that's where we are now.
In 2007, I wrote an open letter to Mo Sheikh. It was in the preparation for Polokwane. And in it, I said to him, I want to plead with you that we don't, in 5 days at Polokwane, destroy what it took 96 years to build. All of us believed in the ANC. It was a movement that was determined to create a better South Africa. Our heroes were there. And holding the family together was very difficult. It required leaders of extraordinary ability. We named our children in their honor. It was difficult because the apartheid regime wanted to take apart the ANC. It was difficult because in a movement where people had so much time on their hands, factionalism is always a big problem.
It's always been the case that the ANC has a fault line between its nationalist, its African nationalist character and side, and its more socialist, class-based side. And the great leaders of the ANC in the past have been able to navigate that tension and to pull both sides towards the centre. Zuma has not only failed to do that, which has resulted in chaos and the sort of cacophony of noise and confusion we see in the cabinet, with people pulling in different directions, and the breakup of the trade union movement, such an important thing. I think in recent times we've also begun to recognise that Zuma, if anything, is sided with the nationalist part of the ANC. Not sided for ideological reasons, because Zuma is entirely non-ideological in my view. And he uses the nationalist part of the ANC to place people in key institutions, to break down those institutions, to control those institutions, all for the self-serving project of Zuma's grip on power.
If one were to draw a distinction between certainly the leadership of President Nelson Mandela, who focused very largely on what it took to convene an inclusive society. When we've descended from that, it's not about convening society, it's about preventing being caught out.
The values have become completely replaced by the opportunism of office, and that's a deep tragedy. And I think that one of the ways in which President Zuma and those around him have opted to play this game is actually to weaken the institutions. When the CEO of the SABC, Claudie Motsoeneng, goes to Parliament and he says, I don't come here to account because I'm not accountable to you. Eskom today, Transnet tomorrow, the SAA the following day. The President just recently, in question time in Parliament, spoke about the competence of Ms. Dudu Myeni. Her claim to fame is that she chairs the Jacob Zuma Foundation, and that seems to be sufficient to be able to run an airline. So all of the rating agencies know how we ratchet up these liabilities and cash injections to state-owned corporations. And when they ask questions, as they must, about the ability of South Africa Incorporated to repay debts, then they have to see us as a bad credit, which is what the ratings are about. The consequence is not borne by the few corrupt individuals. The consequences are borne by the nation. And I think that if you look at all of the institutions, you have exactly the same problem.
Zuma must fall! Zuma must fall! Zuma must fall! We're supporting Jacob Zuma, 100% Jacob Zuma supporters. Send them back to their capitalist white homes. Send them back to the leafy suburbs. Look at them. They never voted for the ANC in 1994. And they will never vote for the ANC now. Wealthy white. You're white. Of course I'm white. I'm white and proud of it, but I'm South African. I'm a member of the ANC. Green and black. From a leafy suburb? No, I come from Chambers Kloof, from the CBD. And I'm part of the struggle. Maybe to you it's leafy, but that's a racist thing. Freedom for South Africa! Down with Zuma! Freedom from Zuma! Hey.
Tax evasion was a national sport under apartheid. And we built an institution with a very strong reputation. We were able to do it in a very short space of time. We staffed that institution with exceedingly competent South Africans who we could lure away from the private sector to work in an institution that would be the pride of our democracy. By building a strong revenue service, we were able to improve on the quality of life of many South Africans because we had the resources necessary to provide education, healthcare, social development, social grants, and a myriad of other services. But of course, the revenue service is not liked by people who have criminal intent. And I could go on. The National Prosecutorial Authority, you look at how it was taken apart, brick by brick, completely demolished. Crime intelligence, detective services, forensic capability, the ability to take basic issues and prepare them for court. All of that is gone. So whether you're talking of individual murders or you're talking of the big issues relating to corruption and so on, the capability has been destroyed.
Any criminal syndicate that exists anywhere needs a compliant, corrupt policeman to help it along the way, to cover up, to clean up. Now, our job is to make sure there are no safe havens by targeting corrupt policemen. That's our job. It's become obvious, especially during this year, 2016, that some of the cases we were investigating were also being investigated by SARS, who were also being investigated by other elements of the DPCI, of the Hawks. And those investigations, some people are not happy with. In fact, when I gave the minister the recommendations on those investigations, he had indicated to me that certain of his comrades would be unhappy with the recommendations in those reports and in those cases. So it was just a matter of time before I would get suspended. And that has resulted in almost 18 months of legal battles on my own, single-handedly, And the people are expected to be part of the battle to reconfirm the constitutionality of this democracy that we're in, defending the democracy, defending independent institutions that are under attack. They were not there. Sadly, they were not there.
Now, you heard a little of my biography, so I'm just going to bring it up to date. So, I used to work for the South African Revenue Service. Okay, and I just lost my job. We won't say more about that. But what I do want to say is that this has happened to a number of other people, such as Robert McBride, a very brave man. Then there's Anwar Dramat. He headed the Hawks. You get the suspensions. Then you get the threatened labor charges and labor disciplinary processes. Then you get maybe some sort of settlement, and then you get criminal charges. So that brings the biography to the present.
Inside the movement itself, there might be fears that some of these institutions might be used against a specific person or a group of people if they stand up. Sometimes it works very subtly. Things are leaked to the paper, you don't have a doctorate and you claim to have one. Sometimes it's brazen, as in the Hawks investigate the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Finance is being investigated for something, breaching some law in which the law doesn't actually even create a criminal offense. It is like investigating somebody for dyeing their hair blue. It is absurd. In that context, I suspect that the faction within the party that is not happy with what is happening are finding it difficult to speak up. So what happens in that case is more and more people go to the courts and they invoke the Constitution, because the Constitution provides a set of rules according to which everybody must behave and govern. Obvious cases is, of course, the Nkandla matter, where after the public protector found that the president had unlawfully been enriched by having some upgrades at his private home, the president was required to pay a certain amount back because that's what the public protector said.
We only have our lives, and therefore we are going to put our lives in defense of this constitution. Let cowards be scared to engage the regime. We are not scared. We are going to fight with everything we have. The only thing that will bring peace here is when Zuma resigns, as a sign of respect to the Constitutional Court and the Constitution itself.
We're in a very precarious position at the moment, I think, in the sense that after about 20 years in which one party, the ANC, was very dominant electorally, but not only electorally, also in terms of its moral authority. That moral authority has eroded, and also the electoral dominance has eroded. We now have, on the one hand, a more competitive political environment, but it feels like there is not strong leadership that could really show a vision forward for the country. Also, of course, because all the role players have not really come to the party to make South Africa a different place, whether it's big business, whether it's universities like my university, whether it's other institutions in civil society. We have not done enough to address the inequality.
My voice. My voice. Your voice. My voice.
are very, very happy, I see. Today. Because today is the day for voting. No, I'm a Zimbabwean, I can't vote here.
Oh, you can't?
I don't have ID.
With the weather, I thought maybe they will not come. But yeah, these people,
today.
they like voting. Mm. And it was peaceful.
Yeah, very peaceful.
I walked one street. We had 400 T-shirts. By the end of the street, they were asking for more T-shirts, and we had to phone to bring more. And that is an expression of where people are. And that is because we have responded to the needs of the people. This is a scientific outcome, where people actually one by one makes the cross. And that is the only survey that counts.
Can someone call the police, please? You know what just happened? They found a stack of ballot papers. Look at this. Look at this. Look at this. This undermines our democracy. These are our votes here, man.
We should call the police. I know they've known the result for hours. They won't announce it. But the facts are that the DA will be the biggest party because that's what you wanted. The people of the Eastern Cape and the people of South Africa have realized that they have power in their hands. When you want to change the government, you can change the government. You don't have to wait for the government to tell you that they'll govern until Christ returns.
I know that the election in 2019 will be much more contested than it's ever been. The more closely contested an election is in other parts of the world, it has been shown, the more contestation there is about the role of the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission has so far been credible in everything it has done, and we hope that that continues, because it's absolutely imperative that that institution must not, in fact or through perception, be believed to be compromised in any way. So as long as that happens, I think we will be fine.
Maybe the group that we have now is a bad bunch, but that's what democracy does. Sometimes you have good leaders, sometimes you have bad leaders. If there's anything that the ANC has been good at doing, that I think that other liberation movements have been very bad at, is that it is responsive to the mood of the electorate. And so I expect a more accountable ANC emerging out of this than one that will look like a ZANU-PF, in which you will resort to repression and all these things.
We want to come and tell us that there are no fee increases. We are not going to accept anything else.
The systematic racism in this country is still real. The effects of apartheid are still real. When a black graduates, we're not fighting the same race as white students. When I graduate, I have 4 people that I have to pay fees for. I have to send money back home. I am so disappointed in the government. Let's not even talk about funding. Let's talk about support. Let's talk about voicing out your opinion on what's going on. Let's talk about coming to our protests and talking to us. Let's talk about not sending police to intimidate us. Why? Jacob Zuma, Blades Monday, whoever's in parliament, are we not fighting the same struggles that you fought back then? How did you feel when police were intimidating you? Why are you doing the same thing to us?
The ANC is still the best movement. most appropriate to be able to do the transformation necessary. Now, the transformation that is required for this country needs resources. And the resources that are required are very often going into the gutter of corruption. So corruption is actually treasonable because it prevents us eradicating poverty, improving the lives of the people, doing the necessary transformation. So people who are corrupt and who encourage corruption and think corruption is good and it's sexy are actually enemies of the people. In every revolution that you've seen on this continent and elsewhere, if you steal the people's money, you can expect the worst punishment. I could never ever regret fighting for my freedom, liberating myself and others. I could never regret that. And establishing a constitutional democracy, I could never regret that. In fact, the system is working. One problem with corruption and corrupt practices that makes it unsustainable is you can't bribe everyone. And we've seen increasingly that the judiciary has remained independent and has remained undeterred by a lot of noise and has done their job without fear, favor, or prejudice. Corrupt government officials don't function on their own. So as a society, we have to do some introspection and see where we need to regain our value-based identity, which makes us South Africans, a miracle nation, a nation that can get things done.
What these pictures show is a time of great promise and a time of hope. I see it backsliding with respect to racism, with respect to tribalism, very subtly, but the cards are being played. Patriarchy, homophobia, xenophobia. We've got a huge legacy, a heavy burden that we carry. We need to make progress because my fear is that we're a fragile, very fragile society. And it needs to be governed with care. And we cannot wait for government or political parties to do this alone.